And
Cool beans. So, Katie, I'm going to go ahead and start off with a couple of questions, just asking you a little bit about your life and a little bit about your inspiration for your current work and your current path. I remember first noticing your name when you had Brett from the Prosecutors. I don't know if I ever told you this. Brett from the Prosecutors podcast on the artistic spirit. And I found it like so interesting and deep. And I went to go follow you on Twitter. And then, have I told you this already? And then I realized I was already following you and I'd already been liking your tweets and like your posts. It was like nice to make the connection. So now, as like an admirer and a friend, and now a friend, wanted to ask, like, what are some of the things that you do now? Kind of what got you here to this point in your life, and maybe what some of your aspirations or goals are.
yeah, I think the deepest aspiration I have is definitely to reach as many people as possible in a profound way. So, kind of like making sure that I'm doing things that expand the way I can reach people, and not just that, but that I'm actually helping them, and that when people come across my content or my coaching or my books, they actually feel like their well is more full, and that they feel more full in their creative life, and that they feel a sense of hope, and that if they're suicidal, they know there's hope, and that they can redefine their circumstances, and that they have the courage to do that, and they're not stuck in any situation. Because I know I've been in situations where I felt stuck by my circumstances, and whether that be being in abusive relationships, healing from sexual assault, things like that. It's so important for anyone to recognize that where you start doesn't have to be the end of your story, and the way people treat you doesn't have to define, and you don't have to internalize it and believe that you deserve that treatment. And that was really big for me, is actually recognizing that the way people treated me wasn't a reflection of who I was, but it was a reflection of who they were, and that I could grow and I could really take action in my life to heal, and that it wasn't this kind of like abstract thing, but it was like the better I treated myself, the healthier decisions I made, the more I established and protected my boundaries, the more I did things that made me come alive, the more I would heal, and that it actually was in my control, and that I could take actions to heal, and that it just wasn't something that I had to wait on. It wasn't something that was so abstract, it would never come to me. And it's
Like that.
really our
And
actions.
is that like the idea that healing isn't, because sometimes people feel like when they go through trauma or they have a difficult time or they're struggling with mental health issues, that they're like a leaf in the wind, and that healing is something that happens to them. Not they wouldn't see it as an active verb, right? Like that I heal, as in I heal myself, as opposed to this being something that happens to them.
Yeah, I would say in terms of that metaphor, I would think the tree is this kind of like societal false self that we feel like we have to be, and we leave that tree and we are a leaf in the wind. And that's part of that feeling of loss when you are coming into, and this is specifically for creatives, your creative identity and releasing that false self, and you are confronted with these truths in life, whether it be that some people do hurt people, and that you have to protect your own safety, and that you have to protect your own well-being, and that you take responsibility for your ideas and your ability to birth them, and you let that leaf go, fall to the ground, and all of your ideas, inspirations, goals are really the seeds that you've been given to sow, and that in the soil you fertilize it with those healthy kind of coping mechanisms like meditation and affirmations. And in the dirt is really the criticism from other people, the fear of judgment, self-doubt, and that's actually necessary to have the soil to be fertilized.
Mhm.
And then you can really grow into your own. And I think sometimes sometimes the advantage that people who've experienced trauma have is that they know that they have to take responsibility for their own healing. And I think that is kind of like something that allows for people to overcome this false sense that other people have control over their lives. And I think
Instead of sort of like perpetuating the victimhood, right?
yes, it's
Feel
so
like,
important.
yeah, you kind of feel like you're a victim, you feel like you're out of control, and because you feel victimized, feel like you have no control of your healing, which just repeats the victimization over and over again, I guess.
Yeah, and going back to the metaphor of like the growing plant or flower, is that really the sun in life is kind of like the impact you could have, and that you keep going when you're helping other people and when you're connecting with people and when you're sharing your lessons and insights. And for some people, that's in their immediate circle, their best friends, their family. Other people, it's people online that they might impact. If you're a speaker, the people in the audience. If you're a writer, your readers. And I think it's so important to recognize that the water that we water ourselves are really the actions we take to heal, and that all of it is a part of a natural process, and that we don't have to let go of self-doubt. We don't have to be these perfect human beings who've never experienced trauma to make an impact or to lead a fulfilling life.
I was going to ask you, what about your life experience led you to focus on this? And what is your goal for other people, like to give, to bring into the world for them?
Yeah, so I would say there's different pockets of people that I think about. Like I think about people who come to me because of their mental health and they just see me as a symbol. And for those people, I just want them to recognize that anything I've done is something they could do, and that even in as hopeless a situation I felt I was in, that I found the hope and that they can do the same. And then creatives, just kind of like that idea that you can have the courage to overcome what you're going through and actually use it as turning that pain into purpose. And you can impact people with your art. You can impact people with the way you speak and how you present yourself, and even online, and different ways.
Yeah. So a lot of different avenues for it. So when it comes to sort of like going through and experiencing trauma, did you instantly kind of have this revelation, or what was it like to, because, being somebody who's experienced like some measure of trauma throughout my entire life, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I may have been different than you in the sense that I don't even think I accepted that I had experienced trauma. It took like an enormous panic attack at one point when I was much older to even realize that I experienced trauma at 9/11, and then not until like 2 years ago uh with some of the things I saw as a journalist. And then I don't know if we talked about this on the podcast episode, but I experienced, my brother and I both experienced sexual abuse as children. And I don't even know if I've fully, like, as ridiculous as it sounds, uh, accepted that as a trauma. Like, and what struck me is, like, my mom passed away in October of this year, and about 2 weeks ago my brother called me, or not called me, we went out to eat, and he was like, were we sexually abused? And I was like, yes, absolutely. And he had asked my father about it, and it just struck me that, like, watching that, the fact that he hadn't processed it, and that experience probably like so affected my ability to have intimacy and my ability to trust people and connect with people, yet, like, I took decades to even realize it. Like, so what was the process like for you?
Yeah, I would first off start by saying I don't know if it's necessary to accept the trauma. I think what it is once you heal, you recognize that it's a part of your story, and it only makes sense looking backwards when you heal because you can connect the dots to how it helped you grow. And I don't think trauma really should ever be accepted. We should always be fighting against trauma. We should always know that it's wrong. We should always make sure that we don't take our trauma and turn it into someone else's trauma. And I think it's so important that we recognize that healing doesn't always come from this blind acceptance, but it comes from rejecting it and knowing that it was wrong and that we didn't deserve it. And kind of like, I think there's a big impact for us to forgive what happened to us and forgive ourselves, because a lot of the times we have that narrative that how how can I keep going when I couldn't even protect myself, or how can I do this when I couldn't do that. And it's not fair to do that to ourselves. So again, we have to recognize that we have to forgive ourselves every single day, and that's something that we have to choose not to inflict the same trauma onto ourselves, and not to take that weight and internalize it to become a prison. And
But what
for
does that
me,
what does it
yeah.
mean though? What does it mean from your perspective?
Mhm.
Like, I get the words, but what does it mean to forgive yourself? Like, what is, like, from your perspective? Because I've always thought of like forgiveness in the context of like letting go and rebuilding relationships with people. But over time, I realized it's not even about like I can forgive somebody and still have boundaries with them and
Mhm.
never let them back in. But it's like letting it. I realize that forgiving is more about something happening in me, letting go of the anger, maybe, or the frustration, or like, what do you mean by forgiving yourself?
Yeah, I think the feeling of forgiving is recognizing that you have freedom from it and that it doesn't define you, and that even though something might happen to you in the past, it's not something that is a it's not something that is your truth. The trauma isn't our truth. Our truth is what the narrative we create around healing from our trauma. And I
Hmm.
think it's so important that we're not just letting go, but we're letting go of the power that the power of the narratives the trauma tells us about ourselves,
Hmm.
which are often
The
unhealthy.
internalization of it.
Mhm. And we forgive that. We forgive the impact while we create something new and beautiful from it. And for me, I do a lot of suicide prevention advocacy, and I was suicidal because of the way people were treating me after my sexual assault, and just the culture I was in of like superficial relationships. And I think it's so important that I take control of my narrative, and that even when I get criticism from people who might have misogynistic narratives around sexual assault, or people who sometimes people say that people who talk about mental health are like attention seeking, and I think that is just absolutely ridiculous. I actually don't get a lot of comments like that, but I do see other people get comments like that. And I think it's so important to recognize that what starts as a pain can be something that turns into a moment of connection with other people. And I don't think there's anything I've ever been through that I haven't connected with someone in some way, that they've been through the same thing, or that
Yep.
they've found hope
Yep.
in my
No,
story.
I mean, I get that in my coaching. When that person who has been sexually abused or attacked walks in the door, I'm able to connect with them more deeply when someone has experienced trauma, like, which actually leads me to a decent question. Do you think that like trauma can be a gift?
Um, I don't necessarily think trauma is a gift. I think what we do with it is our
Mhm.
gift to the world.
Yeah. 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 That it can turn into a gift.
Mhm.
Yeah. Something that can heal us. There on the podcast, you said something, and this is the last thing I was going to ask, but it was this quote along the lines of like, that you would say for anyone who's stuck in a place where they felt that life wasn't living and sort of stuck in that mindset where other people's opinions of you were really driving things, that you just wanted them to know that they had agency and
Mhm.
autonomy, and you wanted them to sort of decide that they could be stronger than their circumstances. And
Mhm.
But you said this part that was like that the reason for it was you believe that people can face anything that they're going through and that they were stronger for what they're going through. And that's kind of like where I was getting at with the idea of it being a gift. And I mean, do you really believe that people can get through anything?
I think, and this is something that's a little wrapped up in the words that I use. I think you're stronger than anything you face, but I do think it's a choice to face it. And I think you're caving in on yourself before you face something, and that you don't have the strength until you find the courage to face whatever it is you're going through, whether that be past trauma, a difficult situation in your life now, or even fears of the future.
Okay. All right. Anything else you want to throw in before we drop down to questions from
I know,
people?
just thanks for having me.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you want to really quickly, just really quickly say the different avenues that you have, the podcasts, the businesses, the other things along those lines?
Yeah, so I'm a creativity coach and writer. I have books on Amazon. Hopefully I could send a link to my link tree. But you can find me on, I think, every platform. At Katie, KatieMorann. My main platform is X, and I put everything there. I have a podcast that's long form called Artistic Spirit, and it's about spirituality, mental health, and creativity. And I have a shorter podcast that's just like a clip show. It's 5 to 10 minutes, and someone will come on and share an uplifting story. And that is called Heartfelt Lift. And I post that on my platforms.
So I thought of one more question as you were talking. Why go
Mhm.
public? Why so many people are afraid to talk about their traumas publicly? And they participate in healing, but why go public with it?
Um,
And
so I had this experience where I had written an article on victim offender mediation. It was an academic piece. And in it I talk about taking back your voice after sexual assault. And I always thought to myself that in it is that's where I found most of my healing about taking
Mhm.
back my own voice. And I remember I was talking about it in a class, and someone had said just how insensitive it was for me to write a piece about victims and offenders having this mediation.
Mhm.
And she didn't read it obviously, because I do address all of that in it. Like it's only optional, it's voluntary, and it's for people who have to face their abusers, like say domestic violence situations where they have kids together and things like that. But she was so hurt. And I remember she just said about what she went through in her own relationship, where she was stalked by a boyfriend, an ex-boyfriend, and she had to go through the court systems, and she was sexually assaulted. And I remember just hugging her as she was crying and just telling her, me too. And then I had this moment where I gave a testimony of when I was um in the UN. I was training for a mindfulness organization, and I gave this speech about
You're
how it
working at
helped,
the UN at that.
yeah, how it helped me overcome my sexual assault. And I was public about what had happened to me, and that was the first time I ever had been. And at the end, I this woman came up to me and she whispered in my ear, me too. And I just remember thinking in those moments, who do I want to be? The kind of person who says that to someone else who doesn't feel supported, or the kind of person that allows for someone to feel supported? And for me, it was very clear who I wanted to be.
Yeah. So for you, it was really about an opportunity to support people. All right. Cool beans. Let me go ahead and open it up for everybody. Hang tight just 1 second. Actually, yeah, let me go ahead and drop it down. Cool beans. And we can come off the StreamYard if you want and go to camera on Zoom if that works.
All right, awesome.
Hey, people. Um, think we got Paula, Sophie, Robert in the house. What's going on, Mr. Palmer? Um, so just want to throw it out to see if you guys had any questions that you wanted to put on the table. I think some of you have heard Katie in the on the podcast episode, and or if you haven't seen Brett on her podcast, it's probably better, certainly better than me being on her podcast. So,
Yours is amazing. Actually, someone said that it gave them hope and they were feeling extremely suicidal before they
oh,
saw your
really?
episode. Yes.
Oh, really? Oh, that's fascinating. That's really kind of cool. I am, I, I found being on there and listening or listening back to it, I thought to myself, wow, I sound a lot wiser than I actually am. Um, I think that's probably true of all podcasts. Anyone have one, or I can just keep on asking my own questions? So I was gonna just throw out to you like just rolling it all back. You know, you had made the point about people really getting attacked for going public and attacked for
Mhm.
sharing things. And certainly I see that. I see a share of that happening with you on. Oh, sorry, my video is clearly not showing. My bad. I see a bit of that happening to you on social media. But I also see a lot of like chains of thank you and appreciation and like love and discussion of like the unique things that are coming from it. What kind of like questions or comments do you normally get, and what kind of like advice and things do you normally send back?
So I try not to, unless it's on creativity, I try not to come from a place of advice. I do get a lot of messages from people who are suicidal and who are struggling, and they just share their story. I share my story, and it's just kind of like an act of solidarity. I always remind people that if they take anything from my story, it's that they're worthy of asking for help and that they can get a coach for whatever it is, whatever area they want to grow in, and they can get a therapist or a psychiatrist for their mental health, and that there are things they can do to feel better. And I think it's so important to recognize that maybe I may not be in a position to help them, but I can make them feel less alone.
Which is huge for people, right? Like,
Mhm.
there's this. I think I talked about this last week that like when you're going through something like abuse or a legal issue or anything, it's really easy sometimes to just feel terminally unique. Like no one else in the world is going through that challenge that you're going through or going through it in the way that you are. And it's really amazing that moment where you find somebody who's walked a few steps in your shoes and you can see that they survived. And that's like, I think, almost more important than any kind of practical help. I remember this from when I was first diagnosed with bipolar. I tried to like survive in New York for a minute and it didn't work all that well. So I came back down to where my family was in Northern Virginia, and my mom and I separately, or sort of together separately, started two different support groups for very selfish reasons that we needed help navigating this world. And one of the most powerful things that people told me about it was that being able to come into a room and see other people who described their feelings in their life, from their past that were very much like your present, and being able to see how far they've come along was huge. And I, yeah, I think our natural tendency is to isolate, right?
Mhm.
Moments. And so, how do you think people get out of that part of it, get out of isolating?
I think
Because
some.
to your point from before, too, there's a lot of
Mhm.
associated with all of this stuff. There's a lot
Yeah.
of shame, and that shame keeps us from sharing often. So how do people get out of that?
I think sometimes isolation can be self-protection if you're not in the situation that is helping you grow and it is stifling your growth. And sometimes solitude can be necessary, specifically for anyone who is someone in the arts. Like solitude is necessary to grow your ideas, to have the ideas necessary to really flourish and have the courage, well, find that courage to bring it to life. And I think it's so important that when I specifically talk about mental health, I recognize that the shame doesn't really belong to me. The shame is something that's put on me and it's something that impacts me. And I'm very clear about the stigma not being something that is related to anything inside of me, but is related to other people viewing and judging me.
Yeah. And I think too, we have a tendency, right? Because even if we try to control the world, like I think deep down for most of us, we know we can only really control ourselves. So the natural tendency, is to go and explore our regrets and past mistakes and try to learn lessons from them. But sometimes we have to, right, to build self-awareness and to grow. But I think we have a tendency as human beings sometimes, not everyone, but of staying in that place. Some people should spend more time in that place, but of staying in that place a little too long, if that makes sense. And that can be a bit of a challenge. So, um, how do you find that right balance of that solitude?
Um, I think to be intentional about it is something that's so important. Right now, I'm going through Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, and actually, I posted about it, and a bunch of people reach out to me. Are you leading a group on this? So now I'm doing like a weekly group, like going through the book with other people, and that I think that the balance really has to be when something is a wound, you go through it on your own, and that the people that help you with it from a wound to bringing it to a scar are those people who are your support system. And then when it's a scar, that's when you connect with other people and you come from a place of service.
Very cool. I like it. So Paula, who is responsible for my beautiful couch and my bookshelves behind me with owls on them, has a comment and a question. So she says that she feels like she has good mechanisms in place to deal with her own trauma, but dealing with someone else's trauma, she said that's so hard. And she's talking about a suicidal friend she had, has recently. He had loaded a gun, felt so helpless, and he was in another state, and she felt like she was, just punting during her conversations with him. And she gives another example of a friend recently who was talking to her about medically assisted suicide. She found that to be an easier conversation because that wasn't imminent, but she was just curious about, like, how do you get basic training to have these conversations, what resources that you can go to. And I'll throw it to you, Katie, because I also have some ideas about that. And Paula makes a point, you don't always have the chance to prepare, so it's good to get ahead of it. So
Yeah, I would say that I would actually kind of like caution people against feeling like they have to train to take care of crisis situations. There are people who are trained, and something my therapist always says to me, like, because she knows I get people talking about some of the worst things they've ever been through to me, just unloading. And she says, if it ever feels like it's triggering you, to stop doing it and to ask other people to stop. And I haven't been in that place where I had to ask people to stop, but I always remind myself that I am just a vessel to bring people resources and the symbol of hope, and that it's important that I actually do have my master's in social work. So I have done clinical practice, but I think it's important that I come from a place where I can only be a vessel to try and help people find the resources for themselves, and that it's not necessary for me to go through training. And I think I think Lady Gaga has a organization where they have free training on how to talk about mental health. But again, I think people come from the perspective that you can just kind of like give people resources and that you can kind of like open the topic of like how much you care about them, and that's why you want them to go take care of themselves. And I
Mhm.
think it's a very different conversation between someone who's trained professionally. And I would say, even if you are trained professionally, if it's someone you personally know, like that might not be the healthiest
Oh yeah,
thing.
I'll say 100% for people who are trained professionally when they're running into those issues in their own lives. Like it's impossible for a person when you care on a personal level for someone to separate yourself and be as sort of I think you have to step back and be empathetic and logical when you're helping people. So it limits what you can do. And to your point, there are lots of great resources like Lady Gaga's organization, Depression Bipolar Support Alliance, NAMI. They can offer resources for the people and therapists, obviously, and psychiatrists, but they can offer resources for the people who are going through it, but there are also resources on some of those sites that talk about how you talk through those situations. And I think it's not about like solving it for them or counseling it through them. I really think it's about listening. That your role as a friend is to be an empathetic, non judgmental ear who can get people to the right resources. So I think sometimes when our friends are depressed or sad, we measure our success as in like somehow they've moved the needle and they've become happier or less suicidal. That's really not it. Like it's really that you were there to listen, sends the message to them that they're worth it to at least someone, if that makes sense. And I think beyond that, um, that's where you really want to, beyond just being able to be there and listen to them and maybe ask them questions about it and non-judgmental. But beyond that, I think it's really a matter of looking for resources. And I think the other thing, you make a really good point, Katie, that when it becomes triggering to you, as it's a sign that it's time to like hand off the ball because there's nothing worse like in my mind when your trauma and someone else's trauma in your personal life are slamming against each other. It won't necessarily lead to great outcomes. Does that make sense, Katie?
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I would also say in crisis situations, sometimes it is good to actually tell someone. And I personally, when I was going through one of my suicide attempts, I called my friend who was I think she was pre-med at the time, and I had took pills and she told me to throw it up, and I did throw it up. But I always think to myself, if she would have contacted someone that would have gotten me help, maybe I wouldn't have continued attempting suicide after that. And I did have a friend who was worried about me and contacted the authorities. And I always, at first, I was very upset with them. And I thought, how could this person do this to me? How could they betray my trust? But actually she's still one of my very best friends, and I see now that she was helping me stay alive, and she's one of the people I go to when I'm upset. And I think there's a difference between kind of like compromising your trust with someone when they're in a crisis situation to save their life, and
Mhm.
being there as a support when they're going through something. And someone being actively suicidal and in a crisis is very different than someone just asking for support as a friend. And that sometimes going to get help yourself can save a life.
Yeah, no, no, no. I agree with you. I remember I had a psychiatrist at one point who was also a therapist, and he one of my friends had referred me to him. Her name was Gail. She was a great person. Um, and Gail she's passed away. But Gail had been suicidal and was like out of control. And so we couldn't really talk about her directly because she was a client, but I'm pretty sure he knew who I was talking about. And, I was dealing with that battle. Like, do I pick up the phone and make the phone call? And he said, something along the lines of like true love for someone will be willing to blow up your whole relationship with them to save them. And that's always stuck in the back of my mind, as something to remember, that like when you love someone, it's about doing right by them, not necessarily always what they want, not necessarily always what you want for your relationship. And I also take your other point about like sometimes picking up the phone, being the one to pick up the phone, and that leads the person not to harm themselves, can be super helpful in a moment. But I once had a client, his name was Isaac. He was just like a wonderful, wonderful guy. And his client, my first client who committed suicide. And Isaac began to equate, like in his mind, if someone picked up the phone, he wasn't going to kill himself. And if they didn't, he was going to kill himself. And he made a call one day and no one picked up on the other end of his phone and he killed himself. And so I think being the right kind of support for people and letting the professionals take the see those kinds of things, who see those kinds of things and know those kinds of things, can be really helpful, and more effective. Enough
Mhm.
of my
And I think going deeper on that, sometimes when we do help people find help, it's not really so much we take off the responsibility of us helping them, because sometimes when we help people, they don't learn the skills to help themselves. And it's so important that people recognize that their life isn't worth living because of the people who love them. Their life is worth living because they exist, and it's their inherent worth, and that they're worthy of existing even if no one loved them.
You had mentioned a little bit earlier, domestic abuse and
Mhm,
situations where people can't escape, you
mhm,
know, trauma for whatever reason. You might get a divorce, but your kids, you still have kids together or something like that, and you have to
mhm.
parent, or an assortment, like financially you don't have the means to do it. There are all sorts of different things. Is the advice that you have for people who are experiencing trauma that they can't get out of different than people who have gotten away from the trauma? Like, can the healing process start before the trauma ends?
I think it's really comes down to people can treat you any way they want, but you can choose to not stay, and you can choose to not believe that you deserve it, and you can choose to talk to yourself in a way that is respectful. And I think healing can occur, like people say, it's not linear. I think you can be in an abusive relationship and still find healing. I think people do. I think sometimes people are in abusive relationships because they feel like their trauma is recognized and they feel like they're working through things, which sometimes at the end has a deeper wound. But it's important to recognize that we could find courage in little ways. And there's this quote, I don't know if I remember the quote in full, but it's just like, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice at the end of the day saying I will try again tomorrow. And I think sometimes we might not exactly know how to get out of a certain situation. And I've been fortunate. I was When I was in an abusive relationship, I was actually financially supporting him, so I was able to leave. I had the means to leave. And I just think to myself that not everyone has that opportunity, but I do think that the more you have courage, the more your life on the inside will look like your life on the outside. And I think it might be one day at a time, one step at a time, but like it's not a matter of like how big our healing is, it's a matter of how profound it is. And that doesn't say anything about size.
What do you mean by bag? Like,
So like say your healing is something like healing that impacts millions of people. Like you see a lot of people
Hmm.
who are motivational speakers who went from bad situations to now impacting so many people. That might look like a big healing experience because it's not only for yourself. But I just want to remind people, even like people who another big experience would be, say you're in an abusive relationship for 12 years and then you leave. That's a big experience. You change your life, you change the outside of your life.
The depth.
Yeah, but it's like profoundly, like sometimes it can just be someone is abusive to you and you decide not to talk to yourself in a way that's abusive too.
Mm.
And I think it's important that you have kind of like those whispers of you'll try again tomorrow. And sometimes it's not even an act of courage. Sometimes the act of courage is holding on and keeping yourself going even when you're going through those things. And when I was in college, I wish I would have had the courage to transfer, but I didn't have the courage to transfer, and I just couldn't imagine switching schools. And
What was it
um
that happened during that time in college? That was
that's when I was sexually assaulted,
sexual
and there were a
assault.
lot of like unhealthy situations, and it was like a culture of like partying and alcohol and drugs, and it just like wasn't healthy, and I was trying to get away from it, but I didn't have the courage to actually transfer because I didn't think it was possible for me to leave the
Mm.
school, to leave my friends. And
Oh,
I actually, yeah, I ended up transferring after my friends graduated, and I did another 2 years to finish my degree. And I wish I would have saw that it was possible to leave earlier and that I could have made that decision for myself, because I think um I would have not attempted suicide so many times because I would have found more happiness and health,
and hope.
and yeah.
And hope.
Um
And a sense of like, even though, control can be a bit of a illusion, but like a sense of like a sense of uh you know, I don't want to say a sense of control, but a sense of the idea that you can have some impact, right? Because in those
mhm.
moments where you might be feeling as if you're a victim, sometimes you don't feel like you can have any impact. Like, what is it like for you from a just definitional perspective? What do you think? What does it mean for you to be um well, let me stop there. Let me rewind to something you once said to me that like stuck out to me. You've had multiple traumas, and you were telling me about your first sexual assault and what it felt like, and in terms of like emotionally afterwards. And then you told me about your second one, and you said something. I remember I was sitting in a hotel room in Idaho, and we were having that first conversation, and it stopped me cold in my tracks because I didn't understand it. But you said like something about the second sexual assault taught you something so profoundly important about the first one. Do you feel comfortable talking about like what you learned?
Yeah. So the first one I actually didn't tell anyone about, and I felt like if it was my word against his, no one would believe me because I wasn't doing that well in school. It was my freshman year, and I was always going out partying, and I just thought to myself, like, he's more respectable than I am. Like, no one's gonna believe me. And he like kind of like made me feel that way too by certain things he said. And that stuck with me for a long time, and I felt really bad about myself, and I felt like a part of it was my fault, if not the whole thing was my fault. And when I was sexually assaulted the second time, I was in grad school. I got early placement into a doctoral class because of work I had done previously. And I remember thinking to myself when I was sexually assaulted that this is not my fault, that if it was my word against his, people would believe me.
Mhm.
And that changed something for me. Um
And so it was almost as if you knew by that second one that the first one didn't happen to me because I wasn't this type of person, or I didn't have these type of grades, or that it helped you realize that just people do this.
yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. So what does being a survivor mean to you, and what's the alternative?
For me, I think the alternative to being a survivor is not being here. and possibly passing away from my suicide attempts. And as a survivor, I think what that means to me is that I am in solidarity with people who've been through other things. And I didn't know that at first, which was part of the reason that loneliness and feeling alone in my trauma was part of the reason that I had so many suicide attempts. I had 8 in the span of 3 years. And feeling hope and feeling like other people had been through things I had been through and that we could inspire each other through our courage was something that was transformational for me. And I saw the play Elephant Man,
Mm,
and it really transformed how I saw my own life, and that no matter how people treated me, I didn't have to be defined by that, and that we're all lovable no matter what we've been through or no matter how people treat us.
yeah. That you're kind of like deserving of love.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was talking about, well, I was going to say I was talking about this with someone recently, but if I talk about this topic with people often where because either we aren't loved or we're treated poorly, sometimes like it builds up and accumulates and it starts to feel as if even though we know it's a bad thing, that this is all we kind of deserve in life.
Mm.
And there's just something powerful about realizing that we as human beings, just the fact that we're on this earth, deserve joy, deserve happiness. Um, it doesn't mean do everything you want to do. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that, but like it's a profound moment when you begin to realize that you deserve something better. Anyway, so anything you want to wrap with? Any other questions, guys, that you have? There are no questions. My friend, what is next for you?
Hopefully a TED Talk on suicide prevention, um, and finishing my fiction manuscript and working on a memoir.
Ooh, what are your tell us about your fiction stuff and your memoir idea.
My memoir is actually going to center around the first time I was ever hospitalized in a psychiatric ward and the friendships and that I made there. It was like 5 days, and I remember my experience with the staff wasn't good, and it was somewhat traumatic. But the people there, people really stigmatize people who go through mental health conditions. But I remember at the end they made me this card, and it was just so brilliant, like the things they said in it. And I think we think kind of like medical professionals are like really like really like are so smart, and like the truth is like sometimes when you're in it, like they're the ones who stigmatize you, and it's really like the solidarity in people who really are stigmatized that we can band together and that we give each other hope. And that was kind of like this transformational experience I had. And then it'd have like flashbacks and flash forwards of my story to deepen why that experience was so significant to me.
I worked with a psychiatrist. He's a forensic psychiatrist. He now runs an entire hospital system, not just psychiatric hospital system. But he once said to me, if I could, if you told me I could only have one thing for my clients, he said, family support, peer support, or medicine. He said it would be no question for him that peer support would be the most important thing. And what you just said reminded me of that. And I felt very much, during my first hospitalization, I found the staff to be great. They were amazing. But the group of people we went through with it together, and they tell you like don't become friends with people you are in the psych hospital. And I do see some wisdom to it. But yeah, they were like being on the journey together with them was amazing. I mean, when I walked out the door, I was kind of sad that I was losing the peace and having to go back into the real world. But what I was really, really sad about is like, you know, being in there with an army of people who are suffering, and we're all sort of soldiers in the same battle, helping each other out. All right, I'll let you close with whatever you want, man. What's your words of wisdom? And then I'll wrap.
Just a reminder that you are stronger than what you face, and the only thing standing between you and what you want is the courage to act for your own healing.
Okay, very cool. Thank you. All right.